The hum of Seekeroyager 8 was constant, a low, resonant thrum that passed through the soles of your boots and settled somewhere behind your sternum, reminding you that 40,000 tons of titanium alloy and composite polymer were the only thing standing between you and the endless cold dark of deep space. For most of the station's 50,000 inhabitants, that hum was as unremarkable as breathing. For James Bishop, it was a heartbeat. Steady. Reliable. Something to count on. He had learned, in another life, to count on very little. James was 35 years old, and he wore those years the way a mountain wears weather. The marks were there if you knew what to look for, but the structure beneath was solid, immovable. He stood 6'2", broad across the shoulders, with hands that were slightly too large for a man who spent his days calibrating microtolerances on gravitational compression drives. His hair was dark brown and perpetually in need of a trim. His jaw was the kind that looked like it had been cut from something that didn't apologize for its shape. His eyes were gray, a specific, particular gray, not the romantic silver that romantic poets romanticized, but the gray of overcast skies over terrain where bad things happen quietly. He had seen those skies. Over a dozen worlds. But that was before. Before he'd buried the man he used to be under 16 months of engineering certifications, before he'd traded his tactical loadout for a magnetic wrench and a frequency calibrator, before he'd requested the most anonymous posting in the Concordat's jurisdiction and ended up here, on a space station that held 200 species and 50,000 souls, where a man could disappear into the beautiful, absurd, overwhelming noise of simply existing alongside the universe's most gloriously diverse population. He liked the noise. He liked the anonymity. He liked that nobody on Seekeroyager 8 asked why your knuckles had the particular scar topography his did, because half the population had their own scars and the other half had learned not to ask. His official title was Senior Mechanical Engineer, Tertiary Systems Division. His unofficial title, the one that spread through the maintenance corridors and repair bays by word of mouth until it reached the stationeers who'd been aboard for 40 years, was simply the best. When the Deck 7 atmospheric processors started shedding harmonic vibrations that 3 teams couldn't diagnose, James diagnosed it in 4 hours and fixed it in 6. When the central docking ring's magnetic guidance system began experiencing micro-failures that the station's AI kept misattributing, James found the actual source, a 17-year-old crystal lattice in a secondary relay no one had thought to inspect, and rebuilt it from components he'd fabricated himself. He didn't boast about any of it. He filed his reports, collected his pay, ate his meals in whatever mess hall was least crowded, and spent his evenings in his quarters with technical schematics spread across every available surface. He was, by every outward measure, a man who had successfully become nobody in particular. Then the Valpine delegation arrived. The Valpine were, by most accounts, extraordinary. They were a species of mammalian bipeds originating from the temperate forest plains of the Rennek system, and they possessed the elegant, unsettling beauty of creatures that had evolved to be both predator and very, very clever. They walked upright and stood anywhere from 5.5 to 6 feet tall, with lean, lithe builds that suggested both speed and endurance. Their faces were angular and fine-featured, with large, expressive amber or gold eyes that caught light the way a cat's did, unervingly, perfectly. Their ears were tall and mobile, rising from the tops of their heads and capable of rotating independently to track sound with a precision that made humans feel watched even when no one was looking at them. Their skin ranged from warm ochre to deep copper, and most Valpine had fine, short fur patterns aloe in their forearms, shoulders, and the dramatic, full tail that extended from the base of their spine and acted as an entire second language of body expression. "Are you the one they call the best?" said a voice from approximately 3 feet away, with an emphasis on the last 2 words that somehow managed to be simultaneously earnest and entirely mocking. James did not respond immediately because he was in the middle of a micro-adjustment that did not permit interruption. "I'll take the silence as a yes," the voice continued. "Silence often is how the very confident choose to confirm things. Very dramatic. Very effective." James withdrew from the crawlway, sat up, and looked at her. She was leaning against the bay's secondary console with her arms crossed and one ear angled toward him with what he would later come to recognize as her entertained posture. Her tail curved in a slow, lazy arc behind her. "You're in an active maintenance zone," James said. "There are 3 posted signs." "I can read," she said. "I read them all. I was particularly impressed by the one in binary. Very retro." "Who are you?" "Kiera Firetail." She said it with the particular Valpine intonation, the slight musical lift on the surname, and extended her hand in the human-derived greeting she'd clearly already learned. "I've been assigned to the joint engineering project." Resonance mechanics, specifically the harmonic interaction between Valpine drive architecture and concordate standard compression arrays. She glanced at the crawlway he just emerged from. Which, coincidentally, is exactly what you appear to be working on. James looked at her hand. Looked at his own, which was covered in calibration compound. Looked back at her. "You're my new project partner," he said. "I am your new project partner," she agreed, with a smile that suggested she found the situation deeply amusing and had no intention of pretending otherwise. In the months that followed, James Bishop came to understand that Kiera Firetail was precisely as difficult as she was brilliant, and she was extraordinarily brilliant. She arrived for their shared shifts in the engineering. Bay already talking, a habit that James, a man who had conducted entire 12-hour missions in near silence, found initially maddening and eventually, against his better judgment, interesting. She talked through problems the way other engineers sketch them, out loud, in full sentences, following threads of logic through vocal space the way a hand traces a schematic. She was almost always right, which was the most irritating part. She was also, with absolute deliberateness, a menace to his composure. "You're doing that thing again," she announced one morning, approximately 4 minutes into their shift, not looking up from her resonance calibrator. "What thing?" "The brooding. The jaw thing. You set your jaw like you're expecting the station to hit you." "I'm concentrating." "You concentrate like a man who's angry at physics. Physics has earned it." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, something between a chirp and a chuckle, high in the register, which he had learned was the Valpine equivalent of genuine delight. Her tail flicked upward at the tip. "There. That's better. You almost sounded like a person." "I am a person." "Debatable. You're possibly a very sophisticated maintenance drone who learned to speak." This was, more or less, how it went. She teased him with the easy confidence of someone who had decided, from approximately day 3 of their partnership, that James Bishop was safe to poke at. She stole his coffee when he wasn't looking, then handed it back with the addition of Valpine spice blend that she knew he'd eventually started to like, though he refused to admit it. She named his diagnostic tablet Gerald and talked to it. She appeared silently at his shoulder at least once per shift to read whatever he was working on, decided opinions already forming before she'd finished the first paragraph, and delivered those opinions whether solicited or not. She was, he thought sometimes, at the end of a long shift when the bay was quiet and the hum of the station was a lullaby, the most alive person he had ever met. He was not going to tell her that. He was not going to tell her anything that she could use. Because Kiera Firetail had the instincts of her species, sharp, quick, calibrated for exactly the kind of thing James was trying to hide, and she saw far more than he was comfortable with. "You were military," she said one evening. "Not a question." They'd been running joint diagnostics on the compression array for 3 hours and had reached a comfortable working silence that she'd just shattered. James did not react. He had been trained not to react. "What makes you say that?" "The way you move around corners. The way you position yourself in rooms. The way you calculate exits." She tilted her head, ears forward. "The way you never talk about your past. A lot of people don't talk about the IR pasts. Most of them do it because the past is boring. You don't do it because yours has weight." She studied him for a moment, amber eyes calm and direct. "I'm not going to ask about it." He looked at her. "Good. I am, however, going to ask about the scar on your left forearm that you got from something that wasn't a machine." She pointed at it with her calibrator stylus. "Kiera." "Fine, fine." She turned back to her console. But her tail, he noticed, was in the slow, thoughtful curve she made when she'd clocked something and was filing it away for later. "I just want you to know that I know." He said nothing. "Also," she added, "Gerald thinks so too." Despite himself, James Bishop almost smiled. The station turned around them. 200 species going about the extraordinary business of coexistence, the Ronnie families crowding the upper market decks with their 6 sets of arms loaded with goods, the great deep-voiced Morlock who worked the docking rings and communicated in vibrations you felt in your teeth, the luminescent Vial who drifted through the station's wide corridors like living auroras, the dozens of other peoples whose languages James had fragments of and whose customs he'd learned the critical points of. Because in a place where 50,000 beings lived in close quarters, knowing when not to accidentally give offense was as important as a gravity anchor. He and Kiera worked. They argued about methodology constantly and productively. They built something genuinely new, a hybrid resonance coupling system that integrated Valpine harmonic mechanics with concordate standard compression architecture in a way that improved efficiency by 31%, and when the first full test ran cleanly, Kiera made the high chirping sound of genuine delight that James had learned, by now, was her actual laugh, and he felt something loosen in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. Others on the station noticed them. The station noticed everything. 50,000 beings in a closed system developed the social awareness of a very large, very attentive village. Engineers from other divisions found reasons to swing past Engineering Bay 12. Their joint supervisor, a Thorani named Osrek by Velen, had mentioned in James's last performance review that the partnership was productive and apparently characterized by significant interpersonal energy, which the review board notes without judgment but with curiosity. James had said, very calmly, that the partnership was professional. Osrek by Velen had said, with the air of someone who had been alive for 80 years and had watched many professional partnerships, that yes, of course it was. It happened on a Wednesday, the station's fourth administrative day, 3 months after Kiera Firetail had walked into Engineering Bay 12 and rearranged the furniture of James Bishop's interior life without his permission. They had just finished the installation of the third phase of their resonance coupling project, which had required 14 hours of uninterrupted work in a level of collaborative precision that left both of them exhilarated in the specific way that good engineering left you, wrung out and satisfied, like the completion of something true. The bay was empty of other staff. The station's lights had shifted to evening cycle, the cooler blue-white of artificial nighttime settling over the corridors outside. James was writing up the completion report. Kiera was perched on the edge of the secondary console, literally perched, in the casual way Valpine often sat when not at their most formal, one knee up, tail hanging loose and relaxed, reading something on her tablet with the focused half-attention of someone winding down. She was telling him about something. She told him things constantly, observations about the station, stories about Renek, technical tangents, opinions about everyone else's engineering methodology. He'd stopped pretending not to listen months ago. Her tail was swishing slowly, the easy rhythm of a contented mood. And here is what happened. James, without any real premeditation, without thinking about it, reached over. He was barely 12 inches from her tail at that moment, because she had at some point migrated to being constantly in his immediate vicinity, and gave it a gentle tug. The way you'd tug on someone's sleeve to get their attention. A slight, good-natured pull on the full copper red plume that it was meant as a joke. A gentle, affectionate ribbing. The kind of casual contact that had been slowly accumulating between them without acknowledgement, the occasional shoulder brush, the time she'd fallen asleep in the bay after an especially long shift and he'd put a thermal blanket over her without waking her, the moment last week when she'd placed her hand briefly on his arm while she was making a point and left it there 2 seconds longer than the point required. It was meant as a tease. Nothing more. Kiera Firetail went entirely still. This was alarming, because Kiera was never entirely still. Her tail was always moving, her ears always tracking, her expression always cycling through something. Still was not her setting. James retracted his hand. Sorry, She turned to look at him. Her amber eyes were very wide. Her ears were straight up, the full alert posture he'd only seen her make twice, both times in response to something genuinely significant. Her tail, which he'd just released, hung perfectly motionless. James, she said. Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard before. It was stripped of the usual music of her teasing, the bright irony she typically wrapped around everything. She sounded precise. Almost formal. Did you just, she stopped. Did you know what you just did? I grabbed your tail. I know I'm sorry, I know that's not. Did you know what it means? She said. He looked at her face. Something about its expression, the wide eyes, the absolute immobility, sent a cold thread through his gut. He had read the xenocultural packet. He knew the tail was sacred, private, not to be touched. He had just touched it. The cultural packet said not to touch. The cultural packet, Kiera said slowly, covers the basic prohibition. It doesn't cover what a voluntary, deliberate tug means. She looked at him for a long moment. The stillness held. In Valpine culture, James, a deliberate tail pull from one person to another, in a context of established closeness, is a declaration of bond. Her tail, finally, moved again, a slow, involuntary curl. We call it the Valanthary. The tail bond. It predates our written language. It means, she seemed to be choosing words with extraordinary care. It means you have chosen someone as your permanent partner. Your mate. In all contexts of life. The engineering bay was quiet except for the hum. James opened his mouth. Closed it. Said, with the careful precision of a man who had just accidentally stepped onto something that might be mined, I didn't know that. I know, Kiera said. Her voice was very even. I know you didn't. I can see that you didn't. She looked at her own tail, as if checking to confirm it was still attached to her. It doesn't matter. What do you mean it doesn't matter? She looked at him. Something moved in her expression, something complicated, layered, and, he would think about this later, in his quarters, for a very long time, something that was not entirely unhappy. The Valanthary is not contingent on intent. In my culture, James, you have bonded with me. I am now bonded to you. She paused. The station's cultural authority will need to be notified. There will be implications. James sat very still for a moment. Then he said, I need to apologize. I genuinely didn't. I know. And something shifted in her face, the ghost of her usual humor returning, but softer, more honest than her regular performances. I know you didn't mean it as the Valanthary. But you did mean something by it, didn't you? Her tail curled slightly at the tip. Because you have never once, in 3 months, touched my tail before. He did not answer. I am not angry with you, she said carefully. But I need you to understand what this is. What it means to my people. She slid off the console. We should talk to Osrek by Velen. And to the Valpine cultural liaison. She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at him, and there it was again, that complicated expression, all those layers. For what it's worth, she said, quietly, without the irony she usually armored things with, the Valanthary can only be initiated towards someone the initiator cares about. Culturally, we believe the body knows what the mind hasn't admitted yet. She left. James Bishop sat in the empty bay for a long time, listening to the station's hum, and thought about that. The station, as noted, noticed everything. By the following morning, word had spread through the social networks of Seekeroyager 8 with the organic, unstoppable velocity of genuinely interesting news. The Valpine community, there were approximately 300 Valpine on the station, processed it with a range of reactions that reflected the complexity of their culture. Several of the elder Valpine came to speak with Kiera personally, their tails held in the formal neutral position of official communication, their voices carrying the measured weight of people taking something very seriously. Among the younger Valpine population, the reactions ranged from fascinated to deeply moved. The Valanthary was not casual. It was not a small thing. And the fact that it had occurred between a Valpine and a human, a species with whom the Valpine had diplomatic and professional relationships but no recorded instan. CE of romantic bond, made it something unprecedented. For some, that precedent was beautiful. For others, it was complicated. For a vocal minority of Valpine traditionalists, it was an outrage. My aunt sent me a message, Kiera told James the next morning, sitting across from him in the mess hall where he'd taken his coffee before most other people were awake, which she had clearly anticipated and positioned herself to intercept. She wants to know your family lineage. James stared at his coffee. I'm sorry. 3 of my colleagues sent messages congratulating me. She tilted her head. 2 sent messages telling me I was disgracing our people. Her tone was light, but her ears were slightly back, a position he'd learned meant she was absorbing something difficult. My mother, she added, sent a message saying she wants to speak with you personally. Kiera. I know, she said. I know this is not what you wanted. I know you're going to tell me that we need to clarify, to explain to everyone that it was a misunderstanding, that we're not actually, she stopped. You can say that. It is technically true that you didn't know what you were doing. The cultural liaison says there is a formal process for disputing a Valanthary when it occurs under misunderstanding. She looked at him directly. We can pursue that if you want. He looked at her. Her tail was held carefully neutral, which she seldom did. She was, he realized, suppressing it deliberately, not letting him read her. "What do you want?" he asked. The question seemed to surprise her. She was quiet for a moment. "That's not," she stopped. Started again. "It doesn't matter what I want, James. We are from different worlds. Different species. Different. Kiera. What do you want?" She was very still for a moment. Then her tail, which she'd been holding carefully in check, moved, a slow, involuntary upward curve, the one he knew meant contentment, warmth, presence. She didn't suppress it in time. She looked down at it with a slightly betrayed expression, as if it had gone rogue. "Your body knows what your mind hasn't admitted yet," James said quietly. She looked up at him sharply. "You said that to me," he said. Something crossed her face, something that was honest, and vulnerable, and entirely Kiera in its complexity. "I am," she said slowly, "going to remind you that I am in a very complicated position, and it is not fair to be charming right now. I'm not trying to be charming. I know. That's the problem." She stood. "I have told the cultural liaison that we need time to discuss. Officially, the philanthropy stands unless formally disputed. We have 30 days at the station." She picked up her tablet. "I suggest," she said, "that we spend some of them talking. Honestly. More honestly than we have been." She looked at him, ears forward, amber eyes direct. "'Cause I think we have both been very careful about not saying things, and I am finding it increasingly exhausting." She left. James sat with his coffee, which had gone cold, and thought that she was right. For the next 2 weeks, they talked. Not just the working conversation they'd always had, the easy technical back and forth that had been the architecture of their partnership. They talked about the rest of it. About Rennek and what it smelled like in the season called the Ember Turn, when the forest plains went the exact color of Kiera's fur, and the air tasted like something burning sweetly. About what she'd wanted when she was young, the particular ambition that had sent her to the Technical Academy at 17 and kept her there burning through every program they offered. About her family, who were, she said with the specific, fond exasperation of someone who loves complicated people, very much Valpine about most things. In return, slowly, in pieces, never all at once, James talked too. Not about the operations. Not the specifics, the places, the names of things. But the weight of it, the years of being the kind of person who was sent to do the things that nobody else could do and nobody wanted to know about, and what happened to a person who did that for long enough without putting it down. The particular silence that had accumulated in him. The reason he'd wanted somewhere loud and anonymous and full of strangers. "You're not nobody," she said, on the 7th evening, in the engineering bay after a long shift, with the lights on evening cycle and her tail curled around her feet on the console where she'd settled. "I know. I don't think you do. I think you came here because you wanted to be nobody, and you worked very hard at it, and you were almost succeeding." She looked at him across the space between them, which had, over the past weeks, quietly reduced itself to something intimate and inevitable. "But you can't be nobody to me. I've seen too much of you." He was quiet for a while. Then, "Is that what the philanthropy is? Seeing too much of someone?" She considered this. It's the moment when the body acknowledges what the eyes have already confirmed. She paused. "I am not going to pretend I wasn't waiting to see what you'd do. What I'd do. With the dispute option. The 30 days. Whether you'd go to the cultural liaison and begin the formal process." Her tail was in the warmth curve again. She let it be. "You haven't." "No," he said. "I haven't." The mess of it around them was real. The traditionalists who had sent Kiera 3 more unpleasant messages, the human crew members who were bewildered or amused or both, the Valpine elders who were watching carefully, the station's social fabric doing what it always did when something unprecedented happened, absorbing, processing, adjusting. The universe was, James had learned, capable of absorbing nearly anything if given enough time. What he was less prepared for was the thing happening inside himself. The way her laugh had started to feel necessary. The way the engineering bay felt different when she wasn't in it. The way he'd caught himself, twice, thinking about her in the terms of the future rather than just the present, not as a colleague, not as a complication, but as a fixture. Something load-bearing. He was a man who had spent years making himself not need anything. He knew, with the clarity of someone who had learned the architecture of his own damage, that this was the fear talking, the part of him that had learned to travel light because heavy things got left behind, or worse, were used against you. But Kiera Firetail had walked into Engineering Bay 12 and named everything he'd been careful not to name, and his body had apparently made a decision his mind was still catching up to. "I know how to do this," he said. "Do what?" "Any of this. The thing you're describing. What you apparently think I'm capable of." She looked at him with those amber eyes that missed nothing. "I know," she said, gently. "But here is something I have learned about you, James Bishop. You are extraordinarily good at things that seem impossible from the outside. You take the broken system and you find the fault and you rebuild it from first principles." Her tail curled. "You are also," she added, with the return of the familiar warmth in her voice, the light touch humor that she used as both shield and window, "going to be absolutely terrible at this in ways I find deeply entertaining, and I am looking forward to every minute of it." He almost laughed. The not quite a laugh that was, he realized, his version of her chirp. "You're awful." "I'm wonderful," she corrected. The two are not mutually exclusive. The trouble with Seekeroyager 8 was the same trouble with anywhere that 50,000 beings and 200 species tried to coexist in 3 square kilometers of pressurized space. Not everyone wanted coexistence. The fractured compact had been operating in this sector of space for 3 years, recruiting from the disaffected fringe of a dozen species, beings who had lost things to the expansion of interspecies civilization, who had grievances, real or manufactured, against the Concordet's governance, who believed that the mixing of peoples like the mixing of incompatible compounds was an inherently unstable and dangerous reaction. They were not, by galactic standards, a large faction. But they were organized, and they were angry, and they had concluded, for reasons that included the symbolic resonance of a human Valpine bond that was being watched by the entire station, that making a point on Seekeroyager 8 would serve their purposes. They took Kiera on a Thursday. James was in Engineering Bay 12 when the station's emergency alert system active. Aided, and he knew something was wrong before the alert fully resolved, because the particular vibration pattern in the station's hull that accompanied a forced breach, an emergency seal, a compromised access port, was one he'd felt before in other contexts and never forgotten. He was running before his diagnostic tablet had finished processing the notification. The security feed told the story quickly. For fractured compact operatives, 2 species he didn't recognize and 2 who were Valpine, that particular betrayal registering with its own sick weight, had moved through the station's lower residential sector and taken Kiera at her quarters. They had a weapon against her neck in the footage. They had sent a transmission to the station's command authority. The Valpine engineer and her human partner, the symbol of everything they opposed, were to be made an example of. They were moving to the station's secondary docking ring. They had a ship. James Bishop stood in the corridor outside Engineering Bay 12, holding his diagnostic tablet, and felt the person he used to be wake up from very deep sleep. He was already moving. The man who had requested the most anonymous posting in the Concordet's jurisdiction had not, strictly speaking, requested the erasure of his history. He had simply not volunteered it. His records, if you had clearance to read them, were a controlled document. They described a decorated special operations soldier who had served for 12 years across 6 major operations on 4 worlds, who had been decorated 3 times, who had eventually requested medical separation on grounds that were listed as psychological in the formal documentation and were rather more complex in reality. He had not become a soft man. He had become a quiet one. These are not the same thing. The station's security forces, a mixed team of 4 species, professional and competent in the context of civil enforcement, were coordinating a response. The response, as James rapidly assessed it while moving through the maintenance corridors with the specific efficiency of someone who knew these corridors better than anyone alive because he had been inside every system they contained, was too slow. Too procedural. The operatives had 7 minutes on their current timeline to reach the docking ring. Security had 12. He diverted through engineering maintenance shaft C7, which nobody else would have known ran directly adjacent to the lower docking ring access corridor. He sealed 2 bulkheads from an emergency panel, not trapping the operatives, not yet, but redirecting them toward a path that narrowed. He killed the lights in the target corridor from the same panel. Then he moved. The darkness did not bother him. He had a schematic of this station in his head with the completeness of someone who had rebuilt most of it from the inside. He moved through it by feel, by the hum, by the knowledge embedded in his hands and feet from 3 years of crawlways and access shafts and maintenance corridors that the station's 50,000 inhabitants relied on and never thought about. He found them in the secondary passage before they reached the docking ring. There were 4 of them. One had Kiera, weapon still at her neck, arm locked around her. The other 3 were armed and positioned with the formation instinct of people who had done this before, not professionals, but experienced. They had light enhancement visors that compensated for the dark. James Bishop did not have light enhancement visors. He didn't need them. What followed was not clean. It rarely was. It was fast, and it was efficient, and it was carried out with the terrible competence of someone who had been trained to do it by the best instructors the Concordet's special operations community had ever produced, and who had then done it for real, many times, until it became something that lived in the body rather than the mind. The 3 armed operatives went down in a sequence that was almost choreographic in its economy. The 4th, the one with Kiera, had approximately 4 seconds to recalibrate to a situation that had become completely different from the one he'd planned for. 4 seconds was not enough. What James had not anticipated was the sound Kiera made when he reached her, not fear, not relief, not even the particular chirping laugh of her delight. It was something lower, something that came from deeper in the Valpine register, something he had never heard from her before. He would later learn it was the sound Valpine made when the Valanthri bond survived a mortal threat, something the language called Velshar, approximately, the holding, confirmed. He had her. She was unharmed. The corridor was lit again, he'd restored power, and station security was coming through both ends at a run. She turned around in his arms, and he could see her expression now, the wide amber eyes, the ears back against her head in the position he'd never seen from her before either, the tail, always the tail, wrapped tight around both of them, an involuntary full-body embrace that she clearly couldn't have controlled even if she'd wanted to. "Hi," he said. She stared at him. Her tail tightened. "You," she said, in a voice that was doing several things simultaneously, "are going to explain to me exactly who you are." "I will," he said. "I'll tell you everything." "Good." She was still staring at him, the wide-eyed honest expression, all the irony stripped. "D away for once." "James." "Yeah. I believe you," she said. "I believe you'll tell me everything." "That's..." Her voice wavered slightly, which was the only sign she was going to allow herself of how frightened she had been. "That's new. For me." Security reached them. James released her, his hands, he noticed, were entirely steady, which was the old training, the thing that kicked in when it needed to, and turned to give the security lead the situational summary. Behind him, he heard Kiera take one long breath and then another, the deliberate Valpine breathing exercise for composure that she'd once explained to him one evening when she thought he wasn't listening. Her tail unwound from him slowly. But not, he noted, entirely. The aftermath of the incident was itself a kind of event, the processing of it by the station's security apparatus, the cultural and diplomatic implications of fractured compact operatives, including Valpine among their number, the formal depositions, the station-wide discussion about what had happened and what it meant. The Valpine community held a formal gathering. The human engineering staff held a less formal but equally intense gathering in the main mess hall. Osrekbai Velen sent a message that consisted entirely of the Thorani phrase that translated roughly as "I noted there was significant interpersonal energy and I was correct." Through all of it, James and Kiera occupied a kind of still center. He told her everything, as promised. Not all at once, it didn't work that way, it didn't come out cleanly in a single unburdening, it came out in pieces, over the following days, in the engineering bay and the mess hall and the observation deck where you could see the star field and the station's own superstructure curving away into it, the improbable architecture of a place 50,000 beings called home. He told her about the operations he'd run and the weight they'd left. About the thing that had eventually broken the seal on his ability to continue and sent him here looking for anonymity. About what it felt like to be very good at something you eventually couldn't justify continuing to be. She listened the way she listened to engineering problems, completely, without interrupting, with the total Valpine attentiveness that missed nothing. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. Her tail was in the slow, thoughtful curl. "You came here to disappear," she said. "Yes." And instead, she gestured at herself. At him. At the space between them, which no longer had any pretense about it. And instead, he agreed. "The universe," Kiera said, "has very poor impulse control. You're blaming the universe. I'm crediting the universe. There is a difference. Sitch. He looked at him directly. Her ears were forward, full presence, full attention. James. I need to tell you something I have been not saying. Okay. I knew. She held his gaze. When you grabbed my tail. I knew you didn't know what it meant. I could see it immediately in your face. And she paused. I had a choice, in that moment, about whether to explain the cultural dispute process before explaining the Valanthary. I chose to explain the Valanthary first. The ghost of her smile was honest and a little wry. I am not entirely without culpability in how this unfolded. He looked at her for a long moment. You wanted to see what I'd do. I wanted to see what you'd do. She confirmed it without flinching. I thought, in the worst case, you would dispute the bond and I would have confirmation that I had misread everything. Which is useful information. I am good at learning from data. The smile deepened slightly. In a better case. In a better case, he said, I wouldn't dispute it. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, for the record, even with the full context of what it means, I don't want to dispute it. Something happened in her expression that he hadn't seen before. Something that stripped away all the layers, the wit, the armor of cleverness, the performance of confidence, and left just her, looking at him with the amber eyes that saw everything. Her tail curved up in the warm arc, slow and full. I know, she said quietly. You've been telling me for a while. You're just very slow to use words. He reached over and took her hand. Her fingers, longer than human, warmer than he expected, curled around his. Is this culturally appropriate? He asked. Holding hands? She raised an eyebrow, amusement returning at the edges. Humans and Valpine have been shaking hands for 60 years of diplomatic contact, James. I meant for two people who are apparently now bonded for life. She laughed, the real laugh, the high Valpine chirp that he had decided was one of the finest sounds in the known universe. It's somewhat required, actually. After the Valanthary confirmation, contact is, she tilted her head. Encouraged. Good, he said. Outside the observation deck's viewport, the star field turned in its slow eternal drift, indifferent and magnificent, and Seekeroyager 8 moved through it carrying 50,000 beings in the ordinary improbable miracle of their coexistence. The weeks after were not simple. The world, or the station, which was their world, did not become easy because two people had decided to be honest with each other. The fractured compact operatives were processed by the Concordet's legal apparatus, a proceeding that required James to file a full accounting of the incident and which, in the process, surfaced enough of his service record that it became, in a limited and station-internal way, known. The reactions to this were mixed. Some people were grateful, some were disturbed. Several engineers who had worked with him for 3 years expressed a sense of having missed something enormous, and one of the Morrock docking workers who communicated in chest vibrations made a sound that the universal translator rendered as of course. It was obvious from the walk. The Valpine community's internal debate about the Valanthary continued. The traditionalists did not dissolve their objections simply because Kiera returned from a kidnapping unharmed in the arms of the man who had come for her. Tradition is not moved by evidence the way an engineering problem is. But some of the elder Valpine who had been watching carefully made formal statements, worded in the specific ceremonial language of Valpine cultural authority, that acknowledged the Valanthary as valid and expressed what translated roughly as recognition of the bond's integrity. It wasn't universal acceptance. It was a beginning. The human community on the station, for its part, was, as humans tended to be, varied and loud about it. James's engineering colleagues were mostly pleased. The administrative staff wanted a formal cultural reconciliation event. 3 different crew members asked him, in 3 different registers of tact ranging from clumsy to fairly clumsy, whether he understood what he'd gotten himself into. He told all 3 of them, with more certainty than he'd have believed possible 6 months ago, that he did. You know what I find interesting? Kiera said, on a Friday evening, the station's 6th administrative day, sitting in the observation deck with her legs crossed and her tail in the full warm curl, her back against his shoulder, the star field their common wallpaper. They had been in some version of this configuration several times in the past weeks, and it had the feeling of something settling into the shape it was always going to be. What? You spent 3 years making yourself invisible. Becoming nobody. She tilted her head back to look at him from below. And then you walked into that corridor, and you were, she paused, choosing the word. Undeniable. That wasn't what I'd call a high point in my self-management. I'm not criticizing. Her voice was easy, thoughtful. I'm saying, the things that you came here to put away. The things you didn't want to be anymore. I don't think you stopped being them. She looked back at the stars. I think you just stopped being them for the wrong reasons. He sat with that for a while. What are the right reasons? 50,000 people on a station that needs working systems and someone good enough to maintain them. Her tail curled loosely around him, a casual claiming, the Valpine equivalent of leaning in. One particular fox woman who would like to continue existing. She paused. Those seem like reasonable reasons. They do, he said. Also, she added, returning to the familiar warm irony that was her native too. Engu, you should know that in approximately 3 weeks, my mother is arriving at the station for what she is calling a social visit and what I am fairly certain is an assessment of the human she has been hearing about. James Bishop absorbed this. Does she know about the corridor? She does. Kiera's tone was light. She sent a follow-up message. In it she said, in Valpine, something that translates roughly as, he is either a warrior or an idiot. Find out which before the bond deepens. She smiled at the stars. I wrote back and told her both options were represented. He almost laughed. The thing he did was almost a laugh. The thing she'd been finding ways to draw out of him for months. And what did she say? She said, and I am quoting, good. Kiera tilted her head back again, amber eyes warm and amused and entirely present. She will like you. She has always had a weakness for complicated things. Is that what I am? You are a man who spent 12 years fighting wars across 6 worlds and then came to a space station to fix gravitational arrays and pretend to be nobody, and you failed spectacularly at the pretending, and now you are sitting here with a Valpine woman who grabbed you by the tail at the first opportunity. She paused. Metaphorically speaking. You didn't grab my tail. You grabbed mine. I grabbed you. She said it simply, without irony, looking at the stars. Those are not different things. Outside, Seekeroyager 8 moved through the dark, carrying its impossible community, 200 species and 50,000 beings and all the ordinary miracles of their intersecting lives, and inside its observation deck, a man who had spent a long time being nobody sat with a woman who had refused, from day one, to allow that, and they were not particularly dramatic about it, which suited them both. 6 months after the incident in the secondary corridor, the Concordat Cultural Registry officially recorded the first verified voluntary bond between a human and a Valpine. The notation in the registry was formal and brief, names, species, station of record, date, but the station's own social fabric had been processing it long before the formal recording made it official, and would continue processing it long after, because 50,000 beings had a lot of opinions and all the time in the world to express them. The hybrid resonance coupling system that James Bishop and Kiera Firetail had designed together was installed in 17 additional stations across the Concordat over the following year, including 3 Valpine home system installations, and was cited in the engineering literature as a landmark integration of human and Valpine mechanical principles. The paper was authored jointly. In the acknowledgments section, Kiera had written, "The authors wish to thank Seekeroyager 8 and its engineering staff for the environment that made this work POS. Cybele, and to note that the best partnerships, like the best systems, are stronger at the interface than either component alone." James had read it 3 times before saying, "You're going to make that insufferable." "Which part?" she asked, looking up from her console with the full performance of innocence she deployed when she was being deliberately transparent. "The partnership line. It's an engineering metaphor. Very appropriate for a technical paper. It's also about us." "Yes." She smiled the honest smile, the real one. "Is that a problem?" He thought about it. About the engineering bay and the schematics and the gravitational arrays and the long shifts and the coffee she kept stealing and Gerald the diagnostic tablet and the hum of the station under everything. About the corridor, and the dark, and her voice saying "I believe you." About his mother, who had turned out to be small and sharp-eyed and deeply, unexpectedly warm, and who had looked at James for approximately 40 seconds before making a statement in Valpine that Kiera had translated as acceptable but whose expression had suggested rather more than that. About the man he'd been and the man he'd become and the particular space between them that wasn't emptiness but distance, a distance you could look across, understand, and choose not to be defined by. No, he said. It's not a problem. Kiera Firetail looked at him across their shared desk, in the engineering bay that was theirs now in every way that mattered, and her tail curled in the full warm arc of contentment. She turned back to her work. James turned back to his. The station hummed around them. It always did. It was a heartbeat, steady, reliable, something you could count on. And in the particular quality of the silence between two people who had learned to speak to each other without armor, it was also, if you were paying attention, something like a held breath. Like the universe, which had, as Kiera had noted, very poor impulse control, waiting to see what happened next.
If you like the story you have heard, subscribe for more out-of-this-world stories of love beyond the stars.